This is a story my grandmother told me about her uncles way before my time. In Union County, on a place called Sharp's Chapel, between the rivers and North Lake. Now this farm was located about a mile from Clinch River, on the Clinch River side of the lake. And it wasn't going to be affected by the building of Norris Dam. A little old two-story farmhouse with about 100 acres. And they worked it, primarily cleared the land herself. Here's a young couple, my great uncle, man. And they grow corn, tobacco, trying to make a living on this farm, trying to start something from nothing. And this is what they worked on most of the farm. And they tried to grow some livestock, hogs, chickens, like any other farm, just trying to start something from nothing and build so they could hand it down through the generations. And this is the tractor of the day, before the combustible engine was ever on the market. This was the tractor of the day, and they worked them hard. And they tried to work this old land after they cleared it, tried to start putting crops on it, and it was a lot of hard work. But they gave it their best try, and they made it work. Now this old farm is nestled, like I said, in between the rivers of North Lake. This is looking north. You can see the Cumberland Mountain Range, just the other side of Powell River. And there was a field here that every time they tried to plow it or do something with it, strange things would occur. They would hear Indian chanting and in the background, but they couldn't figure out where it was coming from or what it was. So they didn't think much of it. They kept working. And every time they come back to this field, they felt like somebody was watching them, sticking their head out between, peeping at them. And it was an eerie feeling, but that didn't bother them. Now, these old mountain people, they ain't afraid of nothing or nobody. They didn't care what it was. They would fight for what they know was right. But there's only one thing that would stop these mountain people: superstition. You'll never find nobody more superstitious than these mountain people. But that's another video. But these people, they believed in superstition and signs. And every time they got in this old field, sometimes they would see faces in the tree. A big old tree there, they'd see a face in the tree, and then it would just fade away. And they would still hear that Indian chant, and they'd be Indians appear in the field here and there, only to just disappear. So they kept working this old farm. They had plenty to work, but they wanted to work the whole farm, but they just couldn't get in it. Because every time they did, they would see stuff like this, and it would puzzle them. Just didn't know. They'd see stuff like this. They would even run after it to see who was that, and they would just fade away. Nobody there. Now the strangest story is, my great aunt said she was working the little vegetable garden next to the house, working on some plants next to the big cornfields, and got to feeling like somebody was messing with her hair, like just kept like a bug or something. But she got to noticing that something was pulling on her hair, and her pulling the combs out of her hair that she had her hair tied up in. And she suddenly turned around, and there stood an Indian right just next to her, and then it just faded away. Well, she screamed and took off running towards the house. Now, Mama said that their uncles told her that, she said, well, 'tain't no Hank gonna scare us out of here. So they worked too hard for this, so they talked it over, said they're going to stay here and tough it out, whatever it takes. Well, they had to milk the cows sometimes and out late from the barn back to the house, and they would hear this Indian chanting. When they was working in the barn, they'd still hear stuff way off in the distance. But nobody bothered them. Nothing bothered them around the house. And he'd look over in the field there to where they're having that problem, and the game seemed to be just fine in that field, picking, browsing like any other animal. Nothing happening. Even the cattle could graze in it. Nobody couldn't figure that one out. But you could not dig in that field. You could not work it. And when you did, tried to do something, they would be Indians appear watching you, and then they would fade away. Now, they started building North Dam in the early 30s. I think it was 1933 they started it. And they acquired all the land next to the lake that would be affected, but this farm would not. It was just on the edge. Now, they had to move a lot of graveyards when they made this lake. Moved a lot or relocated a lot. And the archaeologists come in. They only had about 3 years. They worked as hard as they could on parts of the lake that would affect these burial grounds along the river. And they worked hard at it, and they relocated a lot to museums and reburied them. But places that wasn't affected, like this farm, they would not touch them. Well, the dam was completed in 1936, and it became North Lake. And they filled the valley up. And this is pretty close to the farm right here, North Lake. All this farmland of their neighbors is underwater. And I'm sure there's a lot of Indian burial grounds and graveyards and people buried, these old pioneers, that's still buried under the lake. They didn't relocate them because they didn't know where they was at. Now, they still worked this old farm, but they would not work this section of the farm. They just would not touch it because it was a bad omen, and they didn't want to disturb it. They thought it was an Indian burial ground, and they respected it. Now, to this day, this farm is no longer in the family hands. Back before I was born, this couple never had no children, unfortunately, and they died, and it was passed on and sold. And the last I heard, this around the lake is probably a subdivision. Parts of the farm might be there, but it's no longer in our hands. So, I hope you enjoyed this little story. This is a true story of the unexplained. So, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.